Good afternoon everyone and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. Today we'll be covering the Austroads Guide to Road Tunnels. We'll be looking at an overview of the three-part series. Thank you all of you for making the time this afternoon to join us and welcome. Before we commence with the presentation, as per usual, I'll run through a few housekeeping matters with everyone, so just ask for your attention for a few minutes while we get through those. Les, if you could flick to the next slide, please, that would be terrific. Now, as I mentioned, Les Lewis, of course, is who I'm referring to, and Les will be our primary presenter today. Many of you will be familiar with his name, of course. He's had a very pivotal role in putting these guides together. And as a special guest, we also have Matthew Callender from the RMS joining us today. And he will be available for special comments and, of course, to answer some of your questions. If we could have the next slide, Les, please. And my name's Angela Juhas. Some of you will be familiar with me. I'm the Webinar Program Coordinator here at our group. And if any of you have any queries regarding ARB's webinar program or in fact any training events, I would be your point of contact. Now, as I mentioned before, just a few housekeeping matters before we get the ball rolling with the presentation. So today we're aiming for about 40 minutes of presenting time with about 20 minutes for questions. Now, please don't wait until the end to ask questions. Obviously, the webinar will be more enjoyable if it's interactive, so please get them through to us as we go. We're also recording today's session, and everyone in attendance today will have the recording as well as the presentation material made available to them, which I will send through on the email. So the next slide please, Les. Thank you. Now, just a function of the GoToWebinar program, for those of you who haven't used it before, we ask that you please communicate with our presenters via the questions pane in your control panel. So if you've got a burning question or you've got a comment you'd like to share, please type them in here and we'll receive them at our end. We'll try and answer your questions as we go. Otherwise, we'll answer them at the end, and if we unfortunately run out of time, because we do have a big audience today, then we'll get back to you after the webinar. So next slide please, Les. Wonderful. Now, before we go on to any poll questions, I will get the presenters to introduce themselves. So as I mentioned, we've got Les Lewis joining us, and Les, for those in the audience today that perhaps aren't familiar with your name, could you tell us a little bit more about your involvement with the Austroads Guide to Road Tunnels?
Okay, thanks, Angela.
Sorry, just click on our the third option there, and then that should get rid of that pop-up message indefinitely. Okay. The third one, excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
I didn't realise it was coming up. Well, I've been in the road industry for over 50 years now. But my recent experience has really been with mostly with writing. I've contributed to the various Austroads publications before I started on the Guide to Tunnels. I've done the Queensland Main Roads Planning and Design Manual, the original one, in 2000. I revised that in 2011. And also developed the Queensland TMR road design guidelines for brownfield sites. My role in developing the Austroads Guide to Tunnels was as a technical author, answering to the expert group that was put together to form to develop the manual and develop the guide.
Oh, wonderful. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to have you, and thank you for your time, Les, for joining us today. And as mentioned, we've also got Matthew Callender of the RMS in New South Wales. Matthew, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thanks Angela. Yes, I'm actually the Manager of Tunnel Technology in the Roads and Maritime Services New South Wales. I was on the technical committee for the writing of the Austroads guidelines as the New South Wales representative for RMS. My specialty is fairly broad across tunnels. but particular interest, I guess, is in air quality, fire safety, dangerous goods systems. I'm also heavily involved in the current suite of projects in New South Wales at the moment, including the WestConnex project, M1 to M2, and also smaller tunnel projects such as Tinton-Barter Ewingsdale up on the north coast, which is a short tunnel near Byron Bay.
Fabulous.
And hopefully I'll be able to add some value today.
I'm sure you will. And look, thank you both for your time. It's very much appreciated. Now, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, there is a poll question up on your screen, which means that we are commencing today's webinar with a poll, two polls in fact. I would like to learn a little bit more about our audience. So for those of you out there, you will see a pop-up box on your screen. The question, of course, is, are you a current user of the Guide to Road Tunnels? So if everyone could just click their respective answers and get those through to us, I'll be able to discuss those results with the presenters. Now, I can see that most people have voted, so I will close that off, and thank you everyone for your timely responses, and I will share those results. Okay, presenters, we have 41% of people have answered yes, which is really high, but we actually have a high percentage of people saying that they're not current users of the guide. So 56% of people have said they're not current users of the guide. Are we looking to change that after today's webinar?
I think so, yes.
Okay, wonderful. And just another poll question, ladies and gentlemen, if you could just direct your eyes to your screen again. Are you currently engaged on a tunnel project? And answer choices there, of course, are yes or no. Now, how you answer this, ladies and gentlemen, will help the presenters in tailoring the presentation a little bit so it's more applicable to you. So your honesty is appreciated. And I will just close that off now and share the results. And okay, so we do have another 56% of people saying that they are currently engaged on a tunnel project, with 44% of people saying no. So look, hopefully this webinar will spark a bit more interest to those of you not currently working on a project, and maybe just spark a little bit more interest. So I'll hide those results, and Les, I'll let you get on with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon we'll be providing you with a general overview of the Austroads Guide to Road Tunnels. And while I'll show some illustrations of the content, there will be little discussion of technical details included in the guide. What I will cover is listed on the slide here, mainly an introduction, the process of the development of the guide, the consultation undertaken, the overall content, current status of the guide, and what is intended in the future. There's a picture there of the Eastlink Tunnel portal in Melbourne, so it's quite a striking design, and I guess intended to make a statement about the significance of the tunnel the driver's entering. The presentation is intended to provide you with the background to the development of the guide, including the reasons for it, how it was developed, what the guide contains, its status in the road authorities, what is intended for the future, and how you can provide some feedback. The guide was necessary because there was no national standard to provide uniformity of approach to the design of tunnels, even though there was major expenditure by the authorities on tunnels. It was necessary to establish a common approach that does not need to be negotiated for each tunnel as it arises. And further, it's useful to have a source of information for convenient reference by practitioners. In addition, there were issues that had arisen in the implementation of the various tunnels, and various difficulties had been encountered. For example, there were structural difficulties with the Bogger Road Tunnel in Brisbane, where cracking in the lining occurred. There were some problems with leaks in the CityLink tunnels in Melbourne. In addition, some had high maintenance requirements, and there's a high variability in things like the spacing of escape doors. Further, in environmental requirements, banning of portal emissions appears to be a wasteful approach, and needs some rationality put into it. And it was necessary to resolve the status of the land above the tunnels and what can be done on that land. The major purpose of the guide is to define acceptable standards for tunnels to be implemented by Austroads members. It was therefore necessary to make it useful for practitioners at all levels. However, the guidance is at a high level, not a detailed level, and it is not a manual. But it is the intention that various people will be able to determine what standards to adopt for particular tunnel designs when they arise. In developing the guide, a tunnel technology review panel was set up, which Matthew was one of the members. It covered all the states of the Commonwealth. ARRB is represented, the Commonwealth Government. New Zealand was represented, as well as the local government in Australia. Comprehensive literature review was undertaken, examined learnings from other projects, and we had significant input from a range of organisations and people, 3 of them listed there. Some industry specialists gave us some input as well. I'll talk about that later. And they also provided some writing in some cases. Of course, the process was a normal process in these things. You prepare drafts, you get comments, revise them, review, and revise as many times as you need to get agreement. It was reviewed by the panel, of course, but in addition we had an external review by Arnold Dix to get further expert opinion on the quality of the work that we'd done. In consultation, you have to remember that Austroads is not the same as other Australian standards. They don't go through a public comment stage, but input from industry and others is sought. And we did that, and apart from the technology review panel, which included various experts, of course, and the specialists in the various authorities, about 40 other people external to that provided their expertise for the development of the guide, including the Australasian Tunnelling Society, Australian Tunnel Operators Group, the Australian Fire Authorities Council. City North Infrastructure was a special body set up in Brisbane which no longer exists. Robert Bertuzzi, specialist in geotechnical issues, gave some valuable input. And of course, Donald Dix, who was a member of PIARC committees. PIARC is a permanent international association of road congresses and is a European-based organisation. That's a bit of light relief. This is the longest road tunnel in the world, at 24.5 kilometres long, has 3 caverns such as this to break up the journey. And while the white light is used in the tunnel, there's additional yellow and blue added in these caverns to give the impression of daylight. Time for some questions if you would like.
No worries at all. Thank you, Les. Look, something I'm interested in knowing is you mentioned before that obviously there were a lot of people consulted in the process of the development of the guide. What's the process for industry or other parties inputting into or changing the guidelines? So Matthew, perhaps would you like to take this question?
Sure, thanks Angela. Yes, the process is essentially that we'll take submissions at any time, so that's a process of contacting ARRB. If you have any particular questions, and the tunnel technology group still meets on around about a 6-monthly basis, and we'll take into consideration any questions insofar as that we are looking at updating guidelines at a reasonably regular interval, and as part of that update we would consider anything that people would want covered in more detail or clarified.
Not a problem. All right. Well, I'd just like to reiterate at this point that we are recording today's webinar and everyone will have access hereafter, and everyone will be sent a copy of the presentation material. We have had a few people ask that now, so thanks for getting those questions through. And don't be shy. Keep getting those questions through. We'll make this webinar more interactive and more enjoyable that way. Okay, Les.
Just a further comment, Angela, just about what Les introduced. I think just in terms of the need for the guide, I think consistency across the states and the jurisdictions is a primary goal of Austroads, and that's a major part of the reason why, even though we realise that each jurisdiction and each region has slightly different requirements, they have different conditions, I suppose, different geotechnical conditions and all those sorts of things, and that's, I guess, why we don't go into too much detail. But at the end of the day, it would be the ideal outcome if we had sort of a consistent approach to tunnel design across the country.
Fantastic. All right, look, we have had one more question, so I'll just I'll get perhaps Matthew, maybe your best place to answer this one. The question's come through from Mike. Thank you, Mike. And it goes, in terms of the fire safety, air quality, ventilation, etc., can tunnels for rail authorities use those aspects of the guide?
There's, in actual fact, the guide relies very heavily on the Australian standard for fire safety, 4825, which Les will mention a bit later, and that actually does cover rail tunnels as well. So the way that it's structured in this Austroads guideline is that it simply refers generally off to the Australian standard, which was another document developed by a large committee of people which covered off the fire safety aspects. In terms of ventilation, it's probably not particularly useful for rail tunnels on the basis that ventilation in road tunnels is all about managing vehicle emissions. Whereas in rail tunnels you've got different circumstances and different needs, I suppose, for a ventilation system. So there's it's very much focused on roads. It is the road tunnel guideline, and I think each jurisdiction has their own view at the moment on how rail tunnels should be designed.
All right, not a problem. Okay, Les, we might move on with the presentation in that case, and thank you everyone for getting your questions through.
Okay. Well, the guide is structured in three parts. The first part is the introduction to road tunnels, the second part is the planning, design and commissioning, and the third is operation and maintenance. And I'll go through each of these. In part one, the introduction to the road tunnel, the scope of it, it's a general overview providing definitions and general requirements. It sets the scene for the other two parts. It gives guidance on the planning process to make sure that all the necessary factors are taken into account, and covers those matters that have a strategic planning on a strategic planning of a tunnel solution. There's a heavy emphasis on using risk management techniques in this and other parts of the guide in developing a tunnel design. Note that this part's very general with few specifics. They are in the other volumes where applicable. It identifies all of the issues to be considered and relies on the expertise of the practitioners for the detailed technical input. There's no attempt to address construction issues other than to identify the importance of the construction method on the design requirements. I have two pictures of two construction methods there. The tunnel boring machine was commonly used in Brisbane, and the road header commonly used in Sydney. Now, further, Matthew wants to comment on that.
And yes, Les, that's just on the basis of geotechnical conditions, essentially. So yeah. The road header tunnels in, the TBM tunnels in Brisbane are lined and waterproof, and you get a very good quality tunnel. In Sydney, the sandstone is a very good tunnelling material for road header, and it's very structurally sound, and you can save a lot of excavation by simply cutting out the shape that you need essentially for the traffic and services. Traditionally for a tunnel up to 4 or 5 kilometres in length, the road header seems to be the way to go in New South Wales. This may change in the future depending on the total length of tunnel. I think what we'll find is the longer the tunnel is, the more efficient a TBM approach may become.
Okay, thanks. In part 1, there are 12 chapters altogether. 9 of those cover the general planning and implementation processes, traffic considerations and engineering requirements. That's just a general picture to whet your interest. We haven't seen one of those in Australia. The other 3 chapters are functional safety and operations, environmental considerations and construction methods. There's a commentary, and you note that in Austroads guide, the main text provides the essential information defining standards and other requirements. Additional information of a background nature and detailed explanations are provided in commentaries. And in this part, there's a commentary on types of tunnel construction. Just a sample from the text of part 1. This is the road tunnel implementation process in general terms, showing the range of time that it takes. I don't know if Matthew would like to comment on that.
I've got nothing really to add there, Liz.
Okay.
Well, it does. It adds a very jurisdiction specific and approval methodology and approval requirements for each jurisdiction dependent, I guess. It's also very much funding dependent and financial modelling dependent. So that's one thing I guess we can't go into too much detail on.
No. Okay. And just as a general typical cross-sections of a box type, usually a cut and cover, and an art section, which would normally be a driven type. Any other questions there?
No worries at all. All right. Look, we have had a sort of a comment come through, and perhaps again, Matthew, you might be best placed to answer this one. But some aspects of the guide seem general and lack detailed design information, and perhaps this is a common thought among all the practitioners we've got in our audience today. Why is this the case?
It comes back, Angela, to the need, I suppose, for it to work across different jurisdictions. For example, geometry requirements are different in different states. There's, I suppose, some differences in things like fire safety. There's differences that we needed to take into consideration that we didn't want to, I guess, specify an outcome, noting that people are working under different conditions. And the important thing to realise is that we don't build lots of tunnels. We build them every few years. It's not like the building industry where you've got projects going on continually. The tunnelling sort of, there's quite a gap between tunnel projects. Technology changes, technology improves, it gives you opportunity to innovate going forward, and so we didn't want to close off, I guess, that innovation potentially with too much detail.
Okay, fair enough. We have had a bit of a cheeky question come through, and I did have a little giggle at this one, but I think it's worth asking. Are there any tunnels in Australia that either Les or Matthew you wouldn't drive through? Surely none are quite that unsafe.
Absolutely not. Yeah, no. That's tunnels are proven to be an extremely safe mode of transport in this country. There's been some incidents, some large incidents in tunnels, for example, the Burnley Tunnel fire in 2007. In actual fact, and unfortunately 3 people were killed in that accident, but they were in actual fact killed in a road accident that resulted in a fire, and actually there were no injuries, not even any injuries, never alone any fatalities as a result of the fire. Road tunnels tend to be safer because they are very consistent in their layout. You have consistent lighting. They don't get wet, obviously, because it's not raining in there. So the statistics show quite clearly that it's actually safer from a road safety point of view to travel in a tunnel than it is onto the open road.
Oh, that's
and that
very,
goes for all of our tunnels, yes.
No, that's very reassuring to know. I am a daily user of that Burnley tunnel, so I'll do so with a smile in future, knowing that it's as safe as it can be. So thanks very much for your questions, and we might move on with the presentation then.
Okay. Well, part 2 is the biggest part of the guide, and it's planning, design and commissioning. It does set out the major requirements for the design and commissioning of a tunnel. It's here that the required standards, where they are defined, are provided. And where standards are not specifically defined, then references to acceptable sources for determining what should be done are provided. For example, the PIARC document. And this document is intended to be the benchmark for planning of tunnel planning and design in Australia and New Zealand. We need to note that this current guide does not deal with the refurbishment of existing tunnels, nor the retrofitting of components to existing tunnels. It does describe the commissioning phase and the requirements therein. And should be noted that tunnels are evolving, and therefore this is not intended to be an exhaustive treatment of road tunnels. We'll talk about the refurbishment issues later on. This is just an illustration of a special example where tunnel techniques were applied to the access to the Sydney Opera House. An interesting project. It's still a tunnel type project, even though not the normal type of road tunnel. The contents of part 2, there are 15 chapters in part 2. The first lot of chapters include the general design requirements, the civil engineering design, environmental, safety, fire safety, mechanical, electrical engineering design, ventilation, lighting and power supply. There are further 4 chapters after that, but as just a couple of illustrations from the guide. This is one on ventilation design examples, showing an idealised concentration profile, etc. There are a range of those in the guide. And illustration of ventilation exhaust structures in Sydney. I think these fit in with the local environment pretty well. You might come to Brisbane and see how they make them stand out from the environment. An example of lighting in a tunnel and reflection from the walls to provide a good driving environment. And the last 4 chapters of the part 2 cover monitoring and control requirements, the services, building and plant rooms needed, some construction issues, and the tunnel commissioning. There's an appendix with details for horizontal curves and sight distance, which can be an issue with tunnels. Just an indicative tunnel services building showing the range of things that need to be provided. There's no intention that all buildings would look like this, but the functions have to be provided for where these are supplied. An illustration of the portal to Lane Cove Tunnel in Sydney. It illustrates the requirements to give the driver a clear picture of what the driver is moving into, perhaps encourage them that it is safe. You'll note in this that the lighting in the tunnel shows clearly there's a left-hand curve as you're approaching after you enter the tunnel. There's signing there giving warnings to drivers, and the straight approach allows the whole situation to be fully summed up by the driver. Have any comments on that one, Matthew?
I think it's a good illustration of also how complex portals can be in construction. So there was a lot of work put into keeping the Gore Hill Freeway open during the construction phase, and you've got ramps to Longville Road and ramps to the Pacific Highway, and both on and off ramps, which makes it an extremely complex construction activity. They did a terrific job in this case and managed to keep the traffic moving in all cases. And we've got a product that works really well in the end.
Hey, thanks for that. Now, there were some issues involved that had to be addressed, and these are listed here. The guide does address those issues, but some questions do remain as to the details required, and in some cases, for example, unreinforced concrete, some people don't think that's acceptable at all, whereas others do. Design fire is obviously a significant issue dealt with the Australian standard, and transport of combustible liquids, yes or no. Dispersion of vitiated air from portals, yes or no. External air quality requirements have to meet the governmental requirements and the commissioning requirements. Further issues are what level of sophistication is really required for control systems, electrical requirements for regional tunnels and low traffic tunnels. In other words, how many bells and whistles do you really need? And another thing, how much live loading above the tunnel on the surface can you allow? And know whether you want to make it. So the question arises, are we pricing tunnels out of the market? I don't know whether Matthew wants to make any comment on that.
In terms of, I guess the tunnel construction going forward in, for example, Melbourne and Sydney at the moment is very much a function of fitting it into the existing landscape. So you need to allow for the fact that you're working in a brownfield site. So live loading above tunnels, certainly an important consideration if you've got to go under existing structures and buildings. There might be opportunities to build things on cut and cover tunnels, and obviously you need to plan ahead. You need to make sort of decisions on whether you want to allow for development on top of your tunnel in the future. If so, you'll have to make allowance for that, and that's as much a planning question as it is a road tunnel design question.
Okay, thanks for that. Just a couple of illustrations. They're obviously done with a road header, a three-lane permanent tunnel with permanent rock bolts in it. Any further questions?
Yes, thanks Les. We have had a couple. I might go with this one first. Thank you, Mike, again for your question. So Mike refers to the flowchart that was earlier in the presentation. The question reads, the flowchart up a minute ago mentioned the usual compliance requirements, for example, environmental impact, etc. Does the guide include any general guidance on improving sustainability outcomes in the planning, design, construction, operation and decommissioning? References to ISCA, which is the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. Who'd like to take that one?
Yeah, okay. The guide is fairly broad on that because that is very much a changing feast at the moment. It's very hard to determine. Essentially, we started writing these guides several years ago, and already there's been significant changes in I guess, the attitudes towards sustainability in the marketplace, and it's becoming far more prominent. It's far more important in terms of energy use. Is a really good example for ventilation systems, for example, and Les mentioned portal emissions before. This, coupled with improvements in vehicle technology over time, has meant that the level of emission or pollution that we're designing for is a lot less going forward, and therefore the scale and size of your ventilation system is becoming less, and also the obvious impacts from letting air out of a tunnel, out of a stack or out of a portal is becoming less with time as well, to the point where it's becoming difficult to measure, and as a result the past approach, I think, to over-designing tunnel ventilation systems from as much a precautionary view as anything needs to come to an end for the benefit of sustainability, so and energy use. There's also it's just highlighted in the guide, I think, as something that needs to be considered, and it is becoming much more of an issue as time goes by, and that may be something that we can look further into with the next revision of the guide, because that's where I think the big changes are coming.
Okay, wonderful. Another question from Branko. Thank you, Branko. The question reads, in the introduction you mentioned that portal emissions were a wasteful approach. Does this mean that the portal emissions should be allowed? Could you please elaborate on this?
And I sort of answered that in my last question, and yes, I strongly believe that portal emissions should be allowed. So, but you need to understand, I think, that what I'm suggesting is a managed portal emission approach. So when you have heavy traffic in the tunnel, that you are getting higher levels of pollution, that you may need to put that out of the stack. But if you, as part of your process, you need to assess what the impact to the people around the portals will be exposed to if you do release any pollutants out of the portal. And that's an ongoing issue at the moment. The New South Wales government has set up what's called an Air Quality Consultative Committee, which is chaired by the Chief Scientist and Engineer of New South Wales, Mary O'Kane, and she is looking at this very issue about how we might go about assessing potential portal emissions, and on the basis that if you are going to allow portal emissions, then that needs to the impact of those emissions needs to be negligible or very small on anybody living or working around the portals. And the other side of the coin is that we should be driving towards at least some portal emissions on the basis of energy savings and sustainability.
All right. We've had a comment from Bob. The Sydney Harbour Tunnel has been portal emitting for over 20 years. Thanks for your comment, Bob. All right.
I can just comment on that. Portal emissions actually came about for the M5 East in this country because there were great concerns at the time about the impacts of portal emissions on the surrounding community. And that's a good example of how things change with time. So the Sydney Harbour Tunnel was opened in 1992, and at that time the tunnel actually has a stack which is in the Harbour Bridge pylon, and it is designed to draw emissions out of that stack if required. But the overall conditions for operating the tunnel are completely different for the more modern tunnels. So just because it's got portal emissions doesn't mean it's the wrong answer. In fact, it's very suitable for Sydney Harbour Tunnel, and it may actually in the future be sensible in tunnels like the M5 East or Lane Cove Tunnel, or even the tunnels in Brisbane and Melbourne.
All right, wonderful. Well, we might move on to the next stage of the presentation then. Thank you both.
Okay. Just a question for everyone. In what area do you find it most difficult to find appropriate and sufficiently detailed guidance when addressing problems with tunnels?
All right, well, we might get people to type in their answers to this question in the questions box. So if anyone has any thoughts on this, please do share them, type them through, and I'll read them through to our presenters for their comment as well. What do you suspect will be a popular answer choice here, Les?
Well, I would suspect that how to design for fires might be an issue. The ventilation requirements, the combination of what you do for fires and ventilation is a range of ways of dealing with them, and Matthew's already alluded to these before, so that's a couple of areas that I thought might be of interest.
Oh, wonderful. All right. How about you, Matthew? Any comment on this one? The audience is being very quiet, I have to say, so I might read the question out just in case someone's not quite seeing it on the screen. The question is, in what area do you find it most difficult to find appropriate and sufficiently detailed guidance when addressing problems with tunnels? We have had Josh comment spacing of cross passages, although this seems to be more of an area for the local fire brigade. And thank you, Mike, for your comment as well. Mike says, recent experience delivering a rail tunnel for a road authority in which the specification was not clear, causing some issues during detailed design, hence previous question about applicability to rail tunnels. Thank you, Mike. All right, well, thank you for those of you.
Part of the intent of the question was to perhaps give some guidance to Austroads on areas they might concentrate on if necessary. But we can move on from that.
Absolutely. Well, of course, if anyone does have any comments in relation to that question that do pop up after the webinar, please feel free to get in touch. We'll be most happy to hear from you. Okay, Les, back to you.
Okay, well, on to part 3, which is perhaps the smallest in size of the 3 volumes of the guide. But it sets out the general operational requirements and for the systems described in detail in parts 1 and 2. An important part of that are the protocols required between the various authorities for interaction and coordination when there's a fires with the tunnel. It does set some performance standards for the operation of these facilities. In other words, time to deal with problems that arise, for example, as well as providing guidelines for the operation of the various systems, including the manuals and operating procedures. Having detailed manuals for the operation is an extremely important part of the ongoing performance of the tunnel. I've just listed here all of the contents of Part 3. I couldn't generalise it to any great extent. It has the general requirements and the specific operations requirements, some general maintenance approaches. The human factors is an important part, of course, in tunnel operations, because how will people react when there's an emergency in the tunnel? These have to be taken into account. The training of the people involved in the operation of the tunnel is extremely important, and of course the environment in which they operate has to be dealt with. Just an illustration there of one of the things in there, an example of the tunnel closure treatment, utilising boom gates, signals and signs. Not very clear on there, but it's in the guide. Okay, the current status of the guide. The Part 1 was published in July 2010, Part 2 in November 2010, Part 3 in August 2010. and it's now the adopted guide for all state road authorities. Within Austroads, the policies allow for individual authorities to produce supplementary guidelines to further explain what's in the Austroads guide or to specifically identify particular local requirements. I'm only aware that New Zealand has produced a supplementary guide for this one. In terms of the future of the guide, Part 2 revision is underway, expected to be completed in the next financial year. There is a proposed Part 4 which will deal with the refurbishment of existing tunnels, and I don't have any idea of a timetable for that. Now, as mentioned already, that Austroads and ARB welcome feedback, either corrections to what's in the manual or additions, new information, and the feedback can be sent to these addresses, Austroads at austroads.com.au or info@arb.com.au. Well, what we've tried to show today was the intention of this publication. So we've been trying to get uniformity of practice in Australia and New Zealand. The guidance provided is general in many areas, partly due to the rate of technology, and Matthew's already discussed that before. It's not a textbook on tunnels, unlike some other people who have produced such things. The Norwegian guide's an example, and the US Higher Administration Civil Elements Manual is quite comprehensive. But it does take a position on some issues. In other words, acceptability of emission from portals in a managed way. The live loading in the vicinity of the tunnel, adjacent to it and above it, is dealt with. But it's not intended to provide any form of substitute for the special expertise that's needed to prepare effective and efficient working designs for a road tunnel. So this has been a pretty general webinar today, so just asking the question about what more detailed training or webinar subjects you would like to participate in and should be available.
And thank you for that, Les. And all of our audience here today, when you do leave the webinar, you will receive a very short 5 or 6 question questionnaire that will pop up on your screen. And we do ask this question again. We are always looking to obviously developing new webinars and training topics. Presumably you're all interested in the topic of tunnels, that's why you're here today. So if there is anything specific you would like to learn about, please do let us know, because we very much rely on our members and our customers to provide this information so that we can deliver on that. We'd love to hear what you think. But as I said, you'll get the survey at the end of the webinar, and you can also answer this question then. But actually, while I do have both of you, we have had a couple of other questions come through. A question from Ben. Do any tunnels in Australia have permanent structural monitoring, or would the guide encourage permanent structural monitoring?
The answer is yes. Sorry, Les, did you want to answer that?
No, you go.
Sydney Harbour Tunnel. We had Bob from Sydney Harbour Tunnel ask a question before, and he would know much more about this than I would. But yes, there is structural monitoring. That's a undersea tunnel, obviously. There is a continual monitoring process on the life of the structural elements in that tunnel. Another example is the Cooks River Tunnel on the end of the M5 East, which has allows, I think, for things like cathodic protection of steel and the like, noting that it is submerged under a river. So it tends to be project specific. If you are in a situation where the ground conditions that you're in may be corrosive or create long-term problems for structural elements, then yes, there are examples of structural monitoring.
Wonderful. Okay, we have a question from Stephanie or Steph. She's asking with respect to part 4 of the guide, what will the refurbishment of existing tunnels part 4 guide cover?
Well,
sorry, Les. There's quite a lot of I guess old stock in Australia in terms of tunnels which are 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years old, some of our tunnels. The intent of that guide is to draw on parts of the existing guide for new tunnels, but it has to take into account the existing constraints, I suppose, of you've got a fixed structure. Structural changes are very difficult, but technology has changed considerably, and our view of fire safety, for example, has changed. There might be a recommendation to consider installation of water suppression, for example, upgrading of ventilation systems. Quite often the ventilation systems are not specifically designed for fire safety incidents, and were more designed for ventilation emission management control. That is actually changing over time, or has changed over time, especially for shorter tunnels where there's very little need for ventilation for emission management, but the concerns and risk aspect of a fire in a tunnel has been highlighted in the last 20 years, and that there will be, I guess, recommendations on what's appropriate to bring the tunnel up to not necessarily the best current standard, but a reasonable tunnel standard within the constraints of your existing conditions. Things like tunnel monitoring, cameras, those types of things are all beneficial in terms of safety, and the technology is obviously straightforward now, and it's something that you can retrofit to a tunnel. Traffic management measures to manage traffic in and out of tunnels also can be added to tunnels. So it'll cover I guess the practical aspects of bringing your tunnel, giving its existing constraints up to a reasonable standard of safety.
Okay, great. Another question from Branko. Sorry, Branko's asking, what is your view on tunnel lighting and the use of new technologies such as LED lights? Matthew, would you like to take this one, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. The LED lighting is obviously an emerging technology. We are very open, I think, to considering LED lighting. And really it's all about energy saving with the same light output, if that's feasible. There has been some trials done in I think tunnel in Perth on LED lighting. I think certainly for a large tunnel such as East-West Link or WestConnex or M1 to M2, which essentially won't be delivered for another 5 years or thereabouts, is an absolute consideration for improved lighting technologies, because lighting can form a significant part of energy use in the tunnel, but the considerations are the longevity, the reliability, the lighting levels, and the energy use associated with those technologies. And arguably LED is I guess just starting now to come into its own. I think it's quite it's becoming commercially available from a domestic point of view, and so we can certainly we can learn from that application and consider them in our tunnels going forward.
Well, great, Les. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Matthew's covered that very well.
Okay, not a problem. Bob makes an observation that the capital cost of LEDs is very expensive. Matthew, your thoughts?
Yes, and that's exactly what I'm saying. So at the moment, you need to consider the life cycle cost of installing the system. So if it has a very large capital cost and it saves you not very much in energy use over its life, then at this point in time maybe it's not a viable option. But I think that will, well, I'm sure that will change, and we certainly need to watch this space, I think, over the next 5 years for the changes and for the cost to come down. So even from a domestic point of view, you know, it's possibly, you know, 10 times more expensive to buy an LED fitting than it is to buy a quartz halogen fitting or whatever you normally put in your house at this point in time, and that will come down as the technology improves and things change.
Sure, no worries. Okay, well, our final question for today, and I do thank everyone for getting those questions through and being such an active audience. Our last question from Jeff. Jeff is asking, I guess, with respect to international tunnel projects, are there any noteworthy ones that we're paying attention to at the moment, or yeah, anything we can learn from?
I think that the obvious one at the moment is the Seattle tunnel in, I've forgotten what it's called exactly. It's a very, very large, in fact the largest TBM road tunnel ever attempted, about 7.5 metres diameter, I think, where it's going to have a stacked road, so each direction of road is one direction on top of each other, and it's actually going through a bit of a sticky phase at the moment. The TBM is broken down, so that's one to watch, and in terms of that one, it's the scale of the project is very large in terms of what they're attempting there. So that's very interesting for us. Worldwide, in terms of tunnels, things are slow in terms of infrastructure construction around the world at the moment. The A86, for example, has been open for quite a time now, but that was a very large TBM tunnel project in France. The A73 in the Netherlands. But other than that, I think that everybody seems to be watching Australia at the moment, because we've probably got the biggest tunnel projects in the world proposed or on the drawing board at the moment. So I think it's probably our move.
There is a major tunnel between Denmark and Germany.
Yes, that's true.
Currently underway. It was reported in the Australian Tunnelling Conference in November in Melbourne. I don't know the details, but that seemed like a very major project too. Yep.
All right, well, that just about brings us to the end of our webinar now. So I'd like to sincerely thank both Les and Matthew for their time, not only today, but preparing today's webinar, and for making themselves available even after the webinar for you, ladies and gentlemen. If you have questions that are still burning that you'd like to discuss with them further, their contact details are up there on your computer screen. And I'll be sending those out via email as well, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar. So thank you all of you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We're very pleased to have had such a large audience, and hope that you can join us next time as well. Thank you, everyone, and with that, I'll bid you farewell. Till next time.